Hello, everybody, and it's a huge honor for me to be here, and thank you for having invited me. And if I may, I would like to ask for the technical assistance, and please share my slides.
Sudha ma'am.
Yes, thank you. So if you can enlarge it into a real slideshow, that will be very.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I'm trying to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So it is a great honor to be here. So I'm very happy to be here, and I hope I can give you some interesting information on Shakespeare and early modern popular culture. And I just singled out Morris dancing and hobby horses because these are very characteristic and symptomatic of early modern popular culture, and they do appear in Shakespearean plays. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. The picture that you can see here in this very first slide is a picture that we are going to talk about later on. Yes, please go on. Please go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, because the webinar is entitled The Pleasures of Teaching Shakespeare, I first would like to share my pleasures in teaching Shakespeare and early modern popular culture as a topic. It can be taught on several levels. So I teach BA, MA, and PhD courses, and I always show this picture that you can see to the left-hand side, which is taken from a book, from a printed book that appeared in 1632, and it's called The Crown Conjugal, that is the Crown of Marriage. And it is a conduct book that describes how to be a good husband and how to be a good wife. And if we can just, show the first piece of information here. Yes, and then the second one. Thank you. When it comes to a BA course, so kind of an introduction to this topic, actually I'm having this course this semester, male and female roles, and this course is in early modern England. When we talk about this picture, I ask the students to read the picture. Even if they have no background knowledge in early modern popular culture at all, they can very easily see how men and women in marriage are depicted in this according to this conduct book, or according to this book of advice, and they can reflect and they can discuss how they are dressed, what the hand holding means, and why is the husband pictured as a crowned king, whereas the woman is, although she is supposedly lower in hierarchy, she appears as tall as the man or even a bit taller. And then we discuss the biblical quotations that appear in this on the cartouches, on these inscription pieces, and actually the biblical phrases also talk about the ambiguity in marriage. So there is a hierarchy and there is also a mutual respect in marriage according to the conduct books. When it comes to an MA course, and if we can go to the next piece of information, and this is the title of the MA course that I usually teach, Text in Context, Shakespeare and Early Modern Popular Culture. We dig deeper and we can actually, read the book, or at least parts of the book. Parts of the book are already good for MA students, and we can discuss the genre of conduct books. And also we always go back to Shakespearean plays. So of course the Taming of the Shrew is a seminal text here, but we also mention other male-female forms of relationship and forms of marriage from the Comedy of Errors and other plays as well. And when I have the chance to work with PhD students, we go deeper into early modern popular culture even more. That is, we talk about how cheap print influenced cultural life in London, what the stationers, the producers of cheap print, so what this idea of being the stationer meant, and how cheap print products from quartos, octavos, duodecimos were produced as opposed to folios. So we and we also talk about the popularity of several genres and several books, relying on the most cutting edge and up-to-date research by textual scholars like Andy Kesson and others, and we talk about the popularity of several genres and several books. And we always go back to Shakespeare. We start with Shakespeare and we go back to Shakespeare, because when we start with Shakespeare, it's easy to see, a kind of a launching pad, and then after. When we return to Shakespeare, we have more information on the actual textual piece. What is important, and I always stress when we start talking about early modern popular culture, that early modern culture was quite different from later centuries, in the sense that popular and elite were not that much. I mean, they were different, but they were not divided by a strict dividing line. Rather, there was a two-way traffic between popular and elite cultural products, and also the audiences were shared. So they targeted both upper and lower echelons of society. And this is very nicely illustrated by the picture. And this is the picture that you can see, the Thames at Richmond with the Old Royal Palace. It is a landscape painting, as you can see, and it is in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and it features a Morris dance together with a hobby horse. So you can, on the river of the Thames, you can see Morris dancers, mostly men, and a female figure, plus a hobby horse, a half-man, half-horse figure, and a fool with his ladle interacting with the audience. What is interesting here, and this is quite accurate historically, that a Morris dance that was originally a rural pastime, but also featured in royal and aristocratic entertainments, was a dance that was enjoyed by every layer of society. In the left, in the blown up detail to the left-hand side, you can see this couple in the brownish, blackish colors. The woman is there, and definitely they belong to the middling source, to the so-called middle class of the time. You can see it from the bags and the basket that the woman is carrying. And although the man has a sword at his side, he's not as fashionably dressed as other couples. So they most probably they belong to the middling source or the middling class, as opposed to the other picture, the other blown up detail, where you can see people who belong to the royal court, or at least to the aristocracy. They are wearing, red capes and beautifully decorated female gowns. Even the ruffs are visible, the fashionable rigid ruffs on the women. So it is easy to see that they do belong, if not to the royal court itself, but definitely to the upper echelons of society. So to conclude, this picture nicely illustrates how the Morris dance, a very popular dance at the time and a very popular cultural product of the time, was enjoyed by both aristocratic, royal, and middle-class persons, as well as the lower classes of society. Please go on. Thank you. When Shakespeare first mentions the Morris dance, it's in a history play, one of the earliest plays of Shakespeare. Henry VI, Part 2, York comments on the popular rebel Jack Cade with the following words: "In Ireland have I seen the stubborn Cade oppose himself against a ship of kerns, and fought so long till that his thighs with darts were almost like a sharp-quipped porpentine. And in the end being rescued, I have seen him caper upright like a wild Morisco, shaking the bloody darts as he his bells." That is, you have this rebel, this peasant rebel of sorts, who is described with the arrows in his body, which wounded him, as a Morris dancer, shaking these arrows as if a Morris dancer were shaking his bells, and leaping upright, widely capering upwards. This is the caper upright, taking a high leap upward. To the right-hand side, you can see a picture of a Morris dancer. And it is easy to see how the two are related. The Morris dancer has this very decorated and beautifully patterned shirt or doublet with ribbons, flowing ribbons attached to the elbows, and also the bells are attached to the calves. So when he takes a high leap, which is shown in the picture, these bells are jingling. This is a Morris dancer. Actually, this Morris dancer pictured in this title page of a cheap book, a quarto, is Will Kemp himself. And what is quite interesting, that the Henry VI Part 2, the play, when it was performed, had Will Kemp as one of the actors. He was the clown figure of the companies Shakespeare belonged to, and he was also a quite well-known and a very popular Morris dancer. So when Shakespeare mentions, or when Shakespeare writes these lines about Jack Cade, and picturing Jack Cade as a kind of a Morris dancer, most probably Jack Cade was performed by Will Kemp, who was a famous Morris dancer. So there is a meta-theatrical pun here, a kind of an in-joke for the audience, and also a very vivid description of how lively this rebel was. Also in the picture, can we go back just thank you. Thank you. So just some more words about this picture here. This is the title page of a book, a little book, a quarto that Kemp himself wrote when he went on a solo Morris dance from London to Norwich and back in 9 days. Of course, the journey actually took more than 9 days, but he was dancing for 9 days, and he wrote a description about his journey, and actually he made people bet on his journey and on his feat of Morris dancing, whether he could perform it. And when some people did not pay him, he produced this quarto and published this quarto to get some more money. You can also see the musician next to Will Kemp with a pipe and tabor, the musical instruments that were customary Morris dances. So if you imagine a Morris dance, you should imagine dancers like this and the musician like this. And then we can go on. Thank you. There are other Shakespearean references to the Morris. If you click on it, you can see the first one. Yes, in Henry V, you have the Dauphin, the French heir to the throne, describing the young king of England, Henry V, as a very bad, a kind of a mock king. Therefore, I say it is meet we all go forth to view the sick and feeble parts of France, and let us do it with no show of fear. No, with no more than if we heard that England were busy with the Whitsun Morris dance. For my good liege, she is so idly kinged, her satyr so fantastically born by a vain, giddy, shallow, humorous youth, that fear attends her not. So what is happening here? Quite clearly, the Dauphin is speaking in a derogatory manner about the young king of England, Henry V, and compares him to a mock king, a kind of a king carnival, not a real king, but somebody who is just an idol, a foolish king and not a real one. And the Morris dance is mentioned here as again in a derogatory manner, in a pejorative manner, comparing the king to a country dancer. And another piece of information here is given here with the phrase Whitsun Morris dance, telling us that the Morris dances were very popular at Whitsuntide, which is an early summer festival. Okay, and if we go on, thank you. Another reference to the Morris dance appears in All's Well That Ends Well, where the clown figure, La Vache, gives you a list of similes. As fit as 10 roses for the hand of an attorney, as your French crown for your taffeta punk, as tips rush from Tom's forefinger, as a pancake for Shrove Tuesday, as the nail to his hole, the cockle to his horn, or Morris for May Day, as a scolding queen to a wrangling knave, as the nun's lip to the friar's mouth, nay, as the pudding to his skin. So in this list of things fitting each other, you see the typical things associated with popular culture and with clowns. There is a reference to punks, that is prostitutes. There is a reference to Shrove Tuesday, another festival, and cuckolds and their horns. Also queens, scolding queens of scolds and knaves, that is, rogues of the time, and also to illicit sexuality between nun and the friar, and also to a Morris. So this is quite a fitting reference here, because the clown appears in the Morris, is an indispensable part of the Morris dance. And we can also see the piece of information here that the Morris was also typical for May Day festivities. And this is what we can see in the Puritan Philip Stubbs and other Puritan preachers' denunciation of the Morris dance, when they talk about how the Morris dance is the devil's dance, which is danced in May Day festivals. Okay, please go on. Thank you. The Two Noble Kinsmen, which is a late play, and it's a collaborated play. It was written together with John Fletcher. And actually, it's not so easy to see which part of the Two Noble Kinsmen belongs to Fletcher and which part belongs to Shakespeare. I actually agree with Lois Potter, who says that they were sort of, revising each other's scripts as well. So it's very hard to tell them apart. But what is interesting here, that it has untraditional and traditional elements of the Morris dance. So far we could see that Shakespeare used the Morris dance references in a very tricky way for his dramaturgical purposes, to characterize somebody or to tell some important information about the character or of another character. He always twists popular discourses and popular culture products according to his dramaturgical needs. What happens in the Two Noble Kinsmen is a very special Morris dance. It goes back to a Morris dance of sorts that was danced in a royal aristocratic circle, and which was performed for a royal and aristocratic audience. Beaumont, Francis Beaumont, a good companion and a good friend of John Fletcher, wrote a masque. Actually, it's an anti-masque, so kind of a second masque for the royal court. It was called the Masque of the Inner Temple and Gray's Inn, and it was performed in front of the Queen, the Prince, and Lady Elizabeth in the royal household at Whitehall. What is interesting here is that it has an equal number of male and female dancers, both men and women. So there is a he baboon and a she baboon, there is a he fool and a she fool, which is not customary in typical traditional dances where only men are dancing, and the only female character, the Maid Marian, is actually a cross-dressed man. So you can see that this masque is a kind of a source for the two noble kinsmen and the Morris dance in here, but there are other references. Palamon, one of the knights in the story, who is a highborn knight, is in prison, and when he's in shackles, he refers to a Morris dance in the following way: "Do, good keeper, I will shake them so you shall not sleep. I will make you a new Morris." So he's just simply referring to the fact that when he's shaking his shackles, the irons he's put in, he's shaking them as if a Morris dancer were shaking his bells. But when we come to the actual Morris dance, which is performed on stage, and please, let's have the next piece of information. Thank you. We have a Morris dance performed before Theseus and his royal court. We have countrymen and countrywomen performing the Morris dance, which is again untypical. The jailer's daughter, one of the main characters, joins them as well. And instead of a hobby horse, we have a bavian, which goes back to Beaumont's masque. So it is untraditional, but it is traditional in the way that it again combines popular and elite cultures, because it is performed in front of the royal audience. And the daughter even refers to the hobby horse later on. Next slide, please. To come to a kind of a mid-conclusion at this point, both the Morris dance and hobby horses were very popular in Shakespeare's lifetime. They did appear in several versions and in several forms of culture. And both of them, Morris dances and the hobby horses, became symbols of merry old England, symbols of a golden lost age of sorts. But if we look at them more precisely, it's easy to see that they did exist in different versions. I mean, they were a living ritual, mostly in the country. So especially in the 16th century, Morris dances were highly, highly popular. And we have a lot of church wardens' accounts, and we have a lot of historical documents telling us how this dance was danced at festivals, and they collected money for the parish, and how they paid for the hobby horse costume and so on. By the end of the 16th century, they became less frequent, but they were still performed in the early 17th century. So it was a kind of a living dance in the country. But it was becoming, so by the end of the 16th century, by Shakespeare's time, it was becoming an object of nostalgia for several reasons, not just the Morris dance, but also hobby horses. One of the reasons for them becoming objects of nostalgia was that London was becoming a very huge cosmopolitan city. Not only people of different nations, but people of different social standing flocked to the city in huge numbers. Around 1600, London had roughly 200,000 inhabitants, and a lot of them came freshly from the country, just like Shakespeare did, or just like Marlowe from Canterbury. And they were the type of people whom Peter Burke, the great cultural historian of all time, so everybody knows his name, who deals with cultural history, he called them amphibious creatures, meaning that they were cognizant, so they knew about elite culture and popular culture at the same time, or as he calls it, the little and the great tradition. To put it simply, for these people who were freshly coming from the country, Morris dances on stages, in cheap print products and everywhere, and hobby horses, they signaled something that was familiar to them, and they had personal memories of seeing them, or having seen them, or even having danced the hobby horse, or having danced in a Morris dance. And this can be seen in Ben Jonson's play Every Man Out of His Humor, which was performed in 1599 and then printed in a quarto in 1600. Ben Jonson mocks a country gentleman, Sogliardo, who comes from the country to London to make his fortune. And this Sogliardo talks about how he enjoyed playing the hobby horse in a Morris dance, and he even has the hobby horse costume at home. Actually, I am of the opinion with some other scholars that Ben Jonson is actually mocking Shakespeare himself in this play, and because this Johnsonian play, Every Man Out of His Humor, was performed by the Lord Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare's company, in the Globe. It is not such a wide guess. Anyway, a bit later, after the Elizabethan period, this type of living connection to hobby horses and Morris dances became less prevalent and less dominant. And this is the type of nostalgia that Leah Marcus called antiquarian nostalgia. But still, it was a very, very popular object of nostalgia later on too. And as they reached the city, they became commercialized cultural products. So to put it very simply, it paid well to put hobby horses and Morris dances on the public stage because people liked them. And they were also popular in aristocratic or royal entertainments. Ben Jonson organized this royal entertainment for the new queen after the death of Elizabeth, for the new queen, the spouse of King James I, at Althorp, and it did feature a Morris dance, although without a hobby horse. After Shakespeare's lifetime, hobby horses and Morris dances became more politicized, and this can be seen in other plays of the time, like in John Fletcher's Women Pleased. Then you do have a hobby horse and a Morris dance on stage, but it's very strongly connected to Puritans and how Puritans are mocked by this scene. Let's go on, please. The hobby horse is, I would say, even more important than the Morris dance, because it is not only this Morris dance character, which either featured in the Morris dance or outside the Morris dance, but it is also a very interesting noun. It is a noun that had different meanings, living side by side in Shakespeare's lifetime. So in a way, it presents a kind of a palimpsest of meanings. And I just put a picture of palimpsest here. A palimpsest is this kind of a medieval codex, a medieval page that was craved. So, you know, material was very, very expensive in those times. And when they wrote something on this vellum or on this very expensive material, and they wanted to erase it for some new writing, most of the time the erasure was not perfect. So the old text shone through the new text. And this is what I mean by a palimpsest of meanings, that all the different meanings of the hobby horse in Shakespeare's lifetime are somehow shining through each other or linger in the background. Another important thing here is that it was a highly, highly popular word. We have a lot of occurrences of this word in Shakespeare's lifetime. And if you go to a database like Early English Books Online, it gives you, just a simple search gives you 84 books. And actually there are much more than this, which contain the word hobby horse. Let's go on, please. So what are these meanings that I'm talking about? First of all, it could refer to a horse, just a type of horse. It was a small Irish breed of a horse, and in this meaning, it appeared in horse riding manuals by Gervase Markham and other texts of the time. It could refer to the toy, to the children's toy that you can see in the left-hand side picture. This is an emblem book actually by Henry Peacham, and you can see the toy hobby horse. Or it could refer to the Morris dance character, which appeared either in the Morris dance or not in the Morris dance, but individually. And the picture that you can see to the right-hand side comes from the Batley window, one of the contemporary depictions, one of the two contemporary depictions of the hobby horse. But it could also refer to a fool or a foolish person, or a loose woman, a prostitute, a whore. And with its connotations of a trifle or illicit sexuality or foolish childishness, it was a very, very rich word that could evoke a lot of meanings. Let's go on, please. So when it comes to Shakespeare and the hobby horse, we have 5 plays that contain the word hobby horse in the Shakespearean oeuvre. The first one came in Love's Labour's Lost quite early, and then we have one in Hamlet, one in Othello, one in The Winter's Tale, and finally the reference in The Two Noble Kinsmen that I already mentioned. What is interesting here is that this interest in the hobby horse and the popularity of the word hobby horse seems to permeate the Shakespearean oeuvre. So Shakespeare seems to be interested in this word, throughout his career. And very often the references here, and I don't have time to explain each and every reference here, but at first sight they are connected to sexuality. Goes down, my love, a hobby horse. No, master, the hobby horse is but a colt, and your love perhaps a hackney. And here moth refers to the love of Don Armado as a kind of a prostitute. And similarly in Bianca, the prostitute in Venice, refers to another prostitute with the word hobby horse. And even more painfully, Leontes the king in The Winter's Tale refers to his own wife as a prostitute with the word hobby horse. But there is always much more behind, so that there's more context behind to delve. But because time is flying, I will just have time to talk about one and the most famous reference to the hobby horse, which comes in Hamlet. And this is the one but last slide, if you go on. Yes. So this is the famous reference to the hobby horse in Hamlet. What is interesting is that we have 3 different textual versions of Hamlet, as you may well know, and they are not the same. So there are several differences between the first quarto, the second quarto, and finally the folio text. But this quote is there in every one. So it must have been a quote that was both popular and important for this play. Then there is hope, a great man's memory may outlive his life half a year. But by Our Lady, he must be a church's then, or else shall he suffer not thinking on with the hobby horse, whose epitaph is for all, the hobby horse is forgot. In a way, this quotation summarizes a lot of the things that are related to the hobby horse. This is a scene when we are just before the play within the play. So the audience, the royal audience, Hamlet, Ophelia, Claudius, and Gertrude are preparing or are expecting a play to be performed for them. And Hamlet acts as a kind of a prologue for this play. So, or not only a prologue, but he also acts like a fool, introducing this entertainment. And in his dialogue with Ophelia, he uses a lot of references to vulgarity and sexuality. He refers to lying between a maiden's legs and also to country manners and other similar things. And then he talks about how the hobby horse is forgotten. And how a man must preserve his memory in monuments, in funeral monuments, or otherwise he will be forgotten. So on one hand side, there is a clear reference here for the forgotten old Hamlet, his father, and how he laments, how the young Hamlet laments how the memory of the old Hamlet is slipping away with this reference to the hobby horse. But because it's in the context of this entertainment, where the prince is acting like a fool, the other meaning of the hobby horse as a foolish character or as associated with foolishness is also somewhere there in the background. With the loss of memory, the element of nostalgia is quite clear, and in the context of the dialogue with Ophelia, the references to sexuality are there. And if you just look at this little quotation from a poem from Cobb's Prophecies, Signs and Tokens, kind of a verse pamphlet from 1614, it's easy to see how hobby horses and women were very closely associated. When the Morris dance was danced, the hobby horse was the kind of character who dragged the girls under its skirt, so to say, and did them to something, did something to them. And this is nicely expressed in the verse lines. But when the hobby horse did vihi, oh pretty vihi, then all the benches gave a tihi, oh pretty tihi. So when the hobby horse was neighing, the benches were laughing because they were having good fun together. So this meaning of the hobby horse and how wenches or not so respectable women and hobby horses are related is also lingering in the background. But something that I wrote about in my book, and this is quite a new piece of scholarship that I never met anywhere else, is how viral a phrase it was around 1600. For all the hobby horses forgot appears in 9 different texts around 1600, and well, most scholars said formally that it is the line from a lost ballad, but I try to prove in my book that it's not a line from a lost old ballad, but it must have been a dance song associated with the Morris dance, and it was a very, very popular line that appears not only in Hamlet, but also in in Kemp's 9 Days Wonder and in other texts of the age. So it was a kind of a viral phrase of the time, a crowd tickler when Hamlet was first produced. So to conclude, and this is when we come to the last slide of my presentation. Thank you. To conclude, Shakespeare is best understood if we also have a look at the context in which his plays were written and in which his plays and sonnets were conceived. And this way we can come to a better understanding of Shakespeare himself as well. Thank you for your attention. And this is my book if you are interested.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful theme address.
Thank
May
you.
I now request today's second theme speaker, Dr. Will Christie. Professor Will Christie was head of the Humanities Research Center at the Australian National University to enlighten us on the topic Teaching Shakespeare Politics, the case of Julius Caesar. For the next 25 to 30 minutes, the floor is yours, sir. Over to you, sir.
Right, I hope you can see that. Teaching Shakespeare's Politics, the case of Julius Caesar. I'll start straight away. We haven't got much time. All right, throughout all his plays, though by no means exclusively his history plays, his Roman plays, Shakespeare betrays a fascination with politics in the broadest sense. Fascination with power and its exercise, and with the conflict between different interests within the body politic: selfish interests, family interests, factional interests, national interests. And as far as the limits of the stage allowed, Shakespeare could also dramatize the conflict between different class interests, as anachronistic as that might sound. And never more effectively, perhaps, than in Coriolanus, but also in Julius Caesar, which is what I'm going to talk about, well, tonight for me, this afternoon for you. It's no coincidence that Julius Caesar should open with a confrontation between the tribunes, Flavius and Maurus, and the mechanicals or plebeians, or that the entire plot should turn on a rhetorical performance that directly engages the masses and precipitates the civil war of the closing acts. And I'm referring, of course, to Mark Antony's famous address to his friends, Romans and countrymen, the people of Rome. It's worth reminding our students just what Natalia has been talking about, and that is that Shakespeare's audience was much more socially representative than a modern theatre audience. Drama as a form also lends itself to the kind of dynamic and evolving confrontation that we think of as inherent in politics. And it's not surprising that the media persistently describes political events of great tension and momentousness as dramatic. Shakespeare is often fascinated by the politics of history, by history as politics, but also by the way history, or the past, enters into politics as myth. Politics as it is and always has been practiced is informed by myths, by stories, and by reputations or names. Stories and names shared amongst a faction or across a whole society. Stories and names that are more or less effectively invoked and exploited in political disputation and injunction. And few stories or names would have been as well known to Shakespeare's audience as the story and the name of Julius Caesar. As well as being eminently theatrical and being informed by myths and reputations, politics for Shakespeare is profoundly affected by the character of the different individuals involved. Again, not surprisingly for Shakespeare, the dramatist. The affairs of men may have their impersonal tides, but it is the choice that different individuals make to take them at the flood or not, and why they make that choice that interests the playwright. Character in Julius Caesar stands as an effect of myth and rhetoric. What is said about people and what people say. And in the gap between myth and rhetorical performance on the one hand, and character as temperament, values, and understanding on the other, lies the enigma of the self or personality. In Julius Caesar, the enigmas start with the very title of the play, the name, which, at least according to the early 18th century critic Charles Gildon, ought to be called Marcus Brutus. Ought to be called Marcus Brutus. Caesar is the shortest and most inconsiderable part in it, and he is killed in the beginning of the third act. But Brutus is plainly the shining and darling character of the poet, and is to the end of the play the most considerable person. If it had been properly called Julius Caesar, it ought to have ended at his death, and then it had been much more regular, natural, and beautiful. And Gildon is right. It cannot seriously be doubted that Brutus is the focus, dramatically, psychologically, politically, and morally, to quote Marvin Spivak. But Brutus is not the mythical focus of the play, nor is he the rhetorical focus. In the late 19th century, Edward Dowden put the case for its being Caesar's play. It is the spirit of Caesar which is the dominant power of the tragedy. Against this, the spirit of Caesar, Brutus fought. But Brutus, who forever errs in practical politics, succeeded only in striking down Caesar's body. He who had been weak now rises as pure spirit, strong and terrible, and avenges himself upon the conspirators. Caesar's demon, according to his Greek biographer Plutarch, continued long afterwards to avenge his assassination. Brutus may be the protagonist, in other words, and Caesar may be dispatched early to the other world, but the name of Caesar haunts the action and the characters of the whole play. Indeed, so frustrated was he by the problem of whose play it was, in 1722, John Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham, cut the play in half and created two plays, the tragedy of Julius Caesar and the tragedy of Marcus Brutus. Now, over time, a number of other heroes have been suggested for Julius Caesar besides Caesar and Brutus. Mark Antony, perhaps most obviously. Mark Antony not only gets the best rhetoric, he also gets the best lines. Cassius too has been nominated as the hero of the play. Uniquely amongst the characters, Cassius undergoes a subtle transformation, or Bildung, over the course of the play, from a lean and hungry, envious and disaffected tempter in the opening acts to the willing recipient of some of Brutus's more self-righteous bullying, until finally he becomes a true and loving friend. More imaginatively, though more tenuously, it's been suggested that the plebeians are the true heroes of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and even the city of Rome has been nominated for the Oscar as the leading character in the long ceremony of critical history. But Caesar has priority. He has his name on the play, and Brutus has the stage and the bulk of the lines. The answer as to who should be awarded the title of hero is related to two age-old, inseparable questions. Two questions that are much older than Shakespeare's play, and two questions that would have been on the mind of Shakespeare's contemporary audience. Was Caesar a hero or a tyrant? Was Brutus a patriot or an assassin? If Shakespeare's audience was or is looking for enlightenment, however, they are likely to be disappointed. Not only is there widespread disagreement, quoting Ernst Scancer, not only is there widespread disagreement amongst critics about who is the play's principal character, or whether it has a principal character, there is also disagreement on whether it is a tragedy, and if so, whose, on whether Shakespeare wants us to consider the assassination as damnable or praiseworthy, while of all the chief characters in the play, violently contradictory interpretations have been offered. So, the problem of Julius Caesar. Scancer, of course, wrote famously the problem about the problem plays of Shakespeare. As it turns out, Brutus is the last character to whom we can turn to help us resolve these problems, these questions that I'm talking about. And here he is thinking out loud, rationalizing his complicity with the other assassins. It must be by his death. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. He would be crowned. How that might change his nature, there's the question. It is the bright day that brings forth the adder and that craves wary walking. Crown him that, and then I grant we put a sting in him, that at his will he may do danger with. The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power. And to speak truth of Caesar, I have not known when his affections swayed more than his reason, but 'tis common proof that lowliness is young ambition's ladder, whereto the climber upward turns his face. And when he once attains the utmost round, he then unto the ladder turns his back, looks in the clouds, scorning the base degrees by which he did ascend. So Caesar may, then lest he may, prevent. And since the quarrel will bear no colour for the thing he is, fashion it thus, that what he is augmented would run to these and these extremities. Therefore think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would as his kind grow mischievous, and kill him in the shell. This soliloquy, as Stephen Greenblatt suggests, is far less fluid than anything Shakespeare had written before this, less an elegant and self-conscious poetic meditation, unquote. Greenblatt makes much of Shakespeare's experimentation in this speech, what he calls the still inchoate toing and froing of Brutus's wavering mind, as he grapples with a set of momentous questions. Brutus is speaking to himself, and his words have the peculiar shorthand of the brain at work, says Greenblatt. And he's right. He's right about the shorthand, and he's right about the sophisticated experimentation. But the ellipses and the intellectual stuttering of Brutus's soliloquy betray not just a mind grappling with momentous issues, but a mind with itself at war, a mind working against its own better instincts and attempting to force its own conclusions. After all, it is hardly compelling logic in this speech. Indeed, the soliloquy does not even have the logic of metaphor. We recognize it as a form of casuistry, shot through as it is with tenuous inferences. It is the bright day that brings forth the adder, and self-serving conditionals and peremptory ellipses, lest he may prevent, and the half-hearted, disingenuous resolution that amounts to irresolution. It's worth comparing this speech of Brutus's with one by Mark Antony. I suggested earlier that the fate of Rome turns on Antony's brilliant exercise in verbal manipulation when he moves the plebeians to rage against Caesar's assassins. But the emotional tide of the play turns earlier, when Antony utters his wrath to no one on stage but the dead Caesar. Antony's speech to the plebeians is rhetoric. This, on the other hand, is poetry, figurative, visionary, passionate. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do ope their ruby lips to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. A curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. All pity choked with custom of fell deeds, and Caesar's spirit ranging for revenge, with Ate by his side, come hot from hell, shall in these confines with a monarch's voice cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war, that this foul deed shall smell above the earth with carrion men groaning for burial. Moreover, as David Daniel observes, Brutus' admired good judgment breaks down, sorry, I've got the wrong moment. Anyway, for a brief moment in this brutally passionate soliloquy here of Mark Antony's, we are granted direct access to Antony's feelings, just as we're granted access to Brutus's thoughts in the other speech I read out. The effect here, when Mark Antony is alone on stage and is disingenuous, or his ingenuousness is not an issue, the effect is powerful and visceral. It is at this point that Caesar's spirit, conjured by Antony, becomes an agent in the ensuing events. Antony himself has let slip the dogs of war. By comparison, there is an emotional blankness, a sort of moral laziness about Brutus and his argumentation, possibly even a kind of pervading melancholy, defined as a mental depression, apathy, caused by comparison of the actual state of the world with an ideal state. Right. Vexed I am of late, says Brutus, with passions of some difference, conceptions only proper to myself, which give some soil perhaps to my behaviors. And then poor Brutus, with himself at war, forgets the shows of love to other men. Okay. Perhaps the most important inference we can make from this regarding at least Shakespeare's politics or his political vision is that the conflicts highlighted in the play are not confined to conflicts between different characters and factions. And they include conflicts within the self, or Brutus with himself at war, conflicts of which the characters may or may not be aware. And in the play as a whole, says John Drakakis, one man's truth is another man's theatre. Okay, where are we? Tacitus's claim to being the hero of the rebellion starts to look more and more justified as Brutus's high-minded hypocrisy begins to wear on us in the play. At the same time as we realize that every decision that Brutus makes, insofar as it issues from someone at war with himself, is disastrous. As Edmund Dowden observed, I quoted it earlier, he forever errs in practical politics. Brutus was wrong to exempt Mark Antony, as Cicero thought. He was wrong not to confide in Cicero. He was wrong not to allow the conspirators to swear an oath, as so often in the play, for sententious and sanctimonious reasons. The more we attend to the toing and froing of Brutus's wavering mind, to quote Greenblatt, the more tortured and rationalizing it starts to appear, an elaborate intellectual ritual that distances and isolates him ethically and emotionally from his fellow conspirators. And of course, not just from the conspirators. Brutus was also arguably wrong to deny Portia knowledge of the conspiracy and then to abandon her when he fled from Rome. And most critically, of course, Brutus was wrong to allow Antony to follow him in addressing the people of Rome, and then ultimately wrong to take the battle to Philippi. In itemizing these mistakes, we need to separate, of course, the strategic from the ethical and the psychological. It's actually very interesting to look at the way that in Julius Caesar, that what, hang on, where are we? That everything that Brutus does is in contradiction to the recommendations of Machiavelli in the famous study of the prince or the governor. Rulers must not restrict themselves to dealing with present threats, but use every means at their disposal to foresee and forestall future problems as well. Brutus gets it wrong. You must either pamper people or destroy them. If you're going to do people harm, make sure you needn't worry about their reaction. Again, Brutus fails. And on top of everything else, we must remember that the general public's mood will swing. It's easy to convince people of something, but harder to keep them convinced. So Machiavelli in The Prince, and so Brutus becomes a kind of, strategically at least, clearly an inept political figure, ineffectual. And where he underestimates Antony, Brutus overestimates the people and forgets about the general public's mood as liable to swing. In spite of what some commentators have suggested, Machiavelli is not interested in human motive. The closest thing we get to motive in The Prince is a version of the will to power. The desire to conquer territory really is a very natural, ordinary thing. And whenever men have the resources to do so, they'll always be praised, or at least not blamed. Extraordinary. The motivation of most of Machiavelli's rulers, and certainly that of his paradigmatic ruler, Cesare Borgia, is about as complex as that of a shark. In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, on the other hand, motivation is complex, conflicted, and as I said earlier, in constant negotiation with myth and rhetoric. Where Machiavelli is a pragmatic behaviorist, Shakespeare is a psychoanalyst. It's not just strategic or Machiavellian incompetence that Brutus betrays, it is also a profound self-ignorance. His incompetence, his failure as a leader is bound up with his sense of himself as a Roman and a man of honor. Let the gods so speed me as I love the name of honor more than I fear death. And Cassius confirms, I know that virtue to be in you, Brutus, as well as I do know your outward favor. The audience is asked to take for granted Brutus's Roman credentials, nobility, virtue, honor. Time and again, he is celebrated as the incarnation of a distinctly masculine virtue, the noblest Roman of them all. Like the conspirators, we are being asked to take his credentials for granted as virtues in themselves. They are enshrined in the myth and the reputation, the name of Marcus Brutus. So, what's in a name? What's in a name? And the answer, it turns out, is everything and nothing. Throughout Julius Caesar, we note the play on names, on having a name, on renown, on reputation. This is what I meant earlier when I talked about the importance of myth and reputation in politics itself. Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus. He's talking, of course, of Julius Caesar, Cassius. And we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. Brutus and Caesar, what should be in that Caesar? What should that name be sounded more than, why should that name be sounded more than yours? Write them together, yours is as fair a name. Sound them, it doth become the mouth as well. Weigh them, it is as heavy. Conjure with them, Brutus will start a spirit as soon as Caesar. It's all about names. It's an opinion that Brutus himself, of course, shares, and everyone in the play seems to echo the importance of Brutus's name. The problem is that Brutus also recognizes the disingenuousness of this self-image. And the tension or the disjunction between this, excuse me, high-minded sentiment and sententiousness of Brutus on the one hand, and the psychological, the ethical reality on the other, becomes the spring and focus of the tragic action of the play itself, the cause of Brutus's personal and political undoing, which is both ethical and strategic. And indeed, all the noble characters, except Cassius, struggled to live up to their name of honor. All the Romans, it is Shakespeare's anatomization of Roman self-conscious, mythic self-consciousness. Right. So when it comes to human motivation and social organization, nothing is simple, nothing is certain. Which leaves us then with politics. Factionalism, lobbying, rhetoric, and of course, conspiracy and assassination. As the art of the possible, politics falls short of the idealism of its own naming. It falls short of its own myths. It falls short of its own rhetoric as well. I started by asking, who is the principal character in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar? Whose tragedy is it? And by looking at the deeply ambiguous motivation of Brutus and at the equally ambiguous status of the Roman tyrant hero, Julius Caesar, from whom the play gets its name, we can end by asking whether this ambiguity is not, in fact, the point of the play. And I'll leave you now with a suggestion by David Daniel. Oh, we've got some way to go. In Julius Caesar, after all the clear balancing of this against that, and for all the power of the figures on stage to move us, there comes into view no alternative basis of authority at all, either divine or popular. There is only possession of power. the politics of the school playground, the politics of the school playground. Shakespeare betrays a fascination with politics in the broadest sense, as I said earlier, but the play doesn't clearly endorse either the Republican conspirators or the tyrant they assassinate. Shakespeare is the most political of playwrights. His anatomy of the psychology and theatricality of politics is subtle and comprehensive. Hundreds of 20th century productions of the play will testify to the fact that in his handling of this archetypal political confrontation, Shakespeare has identified patterns of egotism and exploitation and dramatized political psychopathologies that figure and prefigure the appalling hypocrisies and brutalities of political tyranny and political revolution. But Shakespeare is also the least political of playwrights. And we might reasonably ask whether a comprehensive politics is not, in fact, a contradiction in terms. In politics, we define ourselves against what other people think and do. Politics is, by definition, factional and oppositional. It's adversarial. Yet communist Russia and fascist Germany, no less than all the liberal democracies, have been able to adapt Shakespeare's plays to their purposes with a minimum of editorial excision and reorganization. And all of them are right, insofar as none has a monopoly on human idealism, cut across by human self-ignorance, confusion, inconsistency, perversity, and brutality. Thank you.